John Carter had lived on this land for 3 generations. His grandfather built the first barn here, his father expanded the wheat fields, and John himself had spent the last 20 years working tirelessly to maintain it. But today, all of that meant nothing. A white envelope was nailed to his front gate, bold red letters stamped across it, "Final eviction notice." John ripped it open, his calloused hand shaking. The letter was cold, emotionless. The county had approved the sale of his land to a massive real estate developer. They wanted to turn the area into a luxury shopping complex. And just like that, his home, his farm, his entire life was worthless in their eyes. "You have 24 hours to vacate the premises before demolition begins." John's jaw clenched. He looked around at the golden fields swaying in the wind, the wooden farmhouse his father built, and the old tractor parked beside the barn. They were taking everything from him. And for what? Another corporate project? As he stood there, the distant sound of bulldozers and construction crews approaching sent a chill up his spine. "This ain't over," he muttered under his breath. John refused to go down without a fight. He spent the next few hours making calls to lawyers, the local news, even an environmental group that had once helped farmers like him. But every response was the same. "Sorry, Mr. Carter, but the deal is already signed. The county approved the project. There's nothing we can do. You need to leave before law enforcement gets involved." His frustration boiled over as he slammed the phone down. He had spent his entire life on this land, and now he was being forced out with barely a day's notice. Then, as if to mock him, the sleek black SUV pulled up his gravel driveway. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a well-dressed man in a tailored suit, one of the real estate developers. "Mr. Carter," he said with an artificial smile, "I assume you've received your notice. I wanted to personally ensure that your departure goes smoothly." John crossed his arms. "You mean you wanted to make sure I'm out of here like a good little farmer, right?" The developer chuckled. "Let's not make this difficult. We're offering a relocation package, more than fair compensation for your property." John's blood boiled. The compensation was barely enough to buy a small apartment, let alone replace a lifetime of work. "I built this farm with my own hands," John said, voice steady but furious. "And you're stealing it for a strip mall?" The developer sighed, checking his watch. "Mr. Carter, in less than 24 hours, this land won't belong to you anymore. You can leave on your own terms or be removed. Your choice." John's fist tightened, but he said nothing. The developer gave him a mocking nod, then climbed back into his luxury SUV and drove away, leaving only dust and rage behind. But as John stared at the vast open fields, an idea began to form. If they wanted his land so badly, he'd make sure they regretted it. The next morning, John sat on his porch, staring at the horizon. His land, his home, everything he'd built was being taken from him. But then something happened that no one expected. A deep, thunderous rumble shook the ground. The distant sound of rotor blades echoed through the sky, growing louder by the second. John stood up, squinting into the sun. And then he saw it. An Apache attack helicopter was approaching from the east, flying low and fast. The sheer force of the wind from its blades sent a cloud of dust billowing across the field. John's jaw dropped as the massive war machine slowed, hovering just a few feet above the ground, right in the middle of his farm. Then, with perfect precision, the Apache touched down, its heavy frame sinking slightly into the soft soil. John wasn't the only one watching. The developer's crew, bulldozers, surveyors, and construction workers had just arrived at the edge of the property. They stood frozen, staring in shock at the military aircraft parked in the middle of their soon-to-be construction site. John barely had time to react before the side door of the Apache swung open. And stepping out in full uniform was a man John hadn't seen in years. His oldest friend, Captain Ethan Walker, U.S. Army Aviation Corps. Ethan smirked as he removed his helmet. "Heard you were having some trouble, John." John let out a breathless laugh. "You could say that." Ethan nodded toward the developers. "Need me to send a message?" John grinned, feeling something he hadn't felt in days. Hope. The corporate suits and construction crew had no idea what they had just walked into. And this fight was far from over. The moment the Apache helicopter touched down, the entire atmosphere shifted. The construction workers, who had been chatting and laughing, now stood dead silent, their eyes locked on the massive war machine sitting in the middle of John's farm. The corporate suits, including the lead developer, a smug-looking man in an expensive suit and sunglasses, quickly pulled out their phones, frantically making calls. They clearly hadn't planned for this. Ethan, standing tall in his U.S. Army uniform, walked toward John, giving him a firm handshake. "I figured you might need a little backup," Ethan said with a smirk. John chuckled, shaking his head. "You always did know how to make an entrance." The lead developer adjusted his tie nervously before finally stepping forward. "Excuse me, but what the hell is going on here?" he demanded. "This land has been legally purchased for development." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Legally?" He glanced at John, then back at the man. "That's funny because from what I heard, this farm was stolen through some very questionable means." The developer scoffed, trying to regain control of the situation. "That's none of your concern. The law is on our side, and—" But before he could finish, another voice cut through the tension. "Actually, it is his concern." Everyone turned as a convoy of black SUVs rolled onto the property, stopping just feet away from the standoff. The doors flew open, and men in dark suits stepped out. Federal agents. John watched in shock as one of them, a woman with short blonde hair and a sharp gaze, flashed her badge. "Special Agent Carter, FBI." She glanced between the developer and the military officer. "We've been investigating some shady land acquisitions in this area, and it seems like we've found our jackpot." The developer's face turned pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." Agent Carter crossed her arms. "Oh, I think you do." She turned to John. "Sir, do you still have your original property documents?" John nodded slowly. "Yeah. I never let them out of my sight." "Good," she said. "Because this land might not be changing hands after all." The construction workers started backing away, clearly realizing that they wanted nothing to do with this mess. The smug developer. His confidence had completely disappeared. And John? For the first time in a long time, he finally felt like he had a chance to win this fight. As soon as the FBI agents started questioning the lead developer, the entire power dynamic shifted. What was once an eviction notice backed by wealthy investors now looked more like a fraud case unfolding in real time. John stood tall, his worn-out boots planted firmly in the soil that had belonged to his family for generations. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a fighting chance. Agent Carter flipped through a folder she had brought. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, addressing the developer directly, "your company has been under investigation for illegal land acquisitions, forged documents, and using loopholes to force longtime property owners off their land." Mitchell's face turned bright red. "That's ridiculous," he spat, adjusting his expensive tie. "We followed all the legal procedures." Ethan, the military officer, let out a short laugh. "Yeah? Then you won't mind us double-checking those procedures, right?" The construction workers started murmuring amongst themselves. Some even put down their tools, realizing that this project might not be as clean as they were told. A few of them quietly slipped away, not wanting to be associated with a company that was about to go down in flames. John stepped forward, his voice steady. "So let me get this straight. You tried to steal my land, bully me off my own property, and now it turns out you might not even own it legally." The smug developer clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Agent Carter turned to John. "Do you have the original deed to the land?" John nodded and pulled out a weathered envelope from his coat pocket. "Right here. It's been in my family since my great-grandfather settled here." Carter inspected the document, then smirked. "Well, Mr. Mitchell, looks like we have a problem. Because this document is legitimate, and the paperwork your company submitted doesn't match the county records." The silence that followed was deafening. The lead developer swallowed hard, realizing that the situation was quickly spiraling out of his control. Then, in a final act of desperation, he turned to the construction foreman. "Keep working. I don't care what these people say. We have a schedule to keep." But the foreman, a middle-aged man in a hard hat, crossed his arms and shook his head. "No, we're done here." The last of the construction workers walked off, leaving Mitchell standing alone, surrounded by federal agents, a military officer, and a very, very angry farmer. John smiled for the first time in a while. The tables had officially turned. As the last construction worker left, Mitchell's arrogance crumbled. He glanced around, realizing he was completely alone. No workers, no lawyers, no backup. Just the cold, hard stare of FBI agents and a furious farmer who refused to back down. Agent Carter pulled out her handcuffs. Mr. Mitchell, you are under arrest for fraud, illegal land acquisition, and falsifying government documents. Mitchell's face drained of color. You can't do this, he sputtered. I have powerful connections. Ethan, the military officer, chuckled darkly. Oh, we know. That's why you've been under investigation for months. Mitchell whipped around, desperately searching for an escape route. But before he could make a run for it, another agent grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. You have the right to remain silent, Carter continued as she locked the cuffs around his wrists. John folded his arms, watching with quiet satisfaction. Not so fun being forced off land that isn't yours, huh? Mitchell gritted his teeth, but he had no comeback this time. The sheriff, who arrived just in time to witness the arrest, shook his head in disbelief. I had my suspicions about this deal, but I never thought it ran this deep. He turned to John. Looks like you've got your farm back. John exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift off his chest. He looked over at his farmhouse, still standing tall despite everything. His land. His home. As Mitchell was hauled into a waiting black SUV, the reality of the situation finally set in. His empire of corruption had just collapsed. It was all thanks to the stubborn farmer he thought he could bulldoze over. But John wasn't just any farmer. He was a fighter. And he had won. With Mitchell gone in handcuffs, the dust began to settle on what had been the most chaotic 48 hours of John's life. The construction vehicles, once poised to destroy his legacy, now sat abandoned and silent. The farm stood tall, untouched, a symbol of defiance against greed. Agent Carter shook John's hand firmly. You did good, Mr. Reynolds. Without you standing your ground, this operation could have gone unnoticed for years. John nodded, glancing at the Apache helicopter still resting on his land. The pilots were conducting final checks, preparing for departure. Ethan, the military officer, clapped John on the back. You ever thought about a second career in intelligence? He joked. John let out a rare chuckle. I think I'll stick to farming. The sheriff stepped forward, tipping his hat. With Mitchell out of the picture, his deals will be re-examined. You should have no more trouble from developers. For the first time in weeks, John felt at peace. His farm was safe. His land was his again. And the town had witnessed what happens when corporate greed meets an unyielding spirit. As the Apache lifted off, its powerful blades kicking up dust, John stood tall, watching it disappear into the sky. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was the man who fought back and won.